What is happening in Washington right now does not look like normal politics. It looks like a rebellion. For the first time in this presidency, Donald Trump did not just encounter resistance. He encountered a full-scale revolt from inside his own party. It happened less than 3 hours ago. The gavel came down in the United States Senate, and the sound carried all the way to the Oval Office. The vote was not close. It was not ambiguous. It was decisive. The United States Congress just intervened to prevent the president from launching an economic assault on Canada. Trump tried to corner his northern neighbor. He tried to deploy what he considered the ultimate weapon, a 25% universal tariff on every product crossing the border. He was certain he had the leverage. He was certain Canada would capitulate the way other nations had when faced with similar pressure. He expected surrender. Mark Carney did not surrender. He did not raise his voice. He did not engage in public confrontation. He methodically dismantled Trump's entire strategy from the inside. And now the consequences are cascading through Washington and through financial markets simultaneously. The White House is scrambling. Trading floors are volatile. And for the first time, a question that was previously unthinkable is being asked openly. Is the president losing control of his own coalition? Let me take you through exactly what changed today, the leverage Carney deployed, the Republicans who broke ranks, and why, even if you live nowhere near the Canadian border, this vote just protected your household. Budget from damage you would have felt within days. At 2 Eastern Time, the Senate passed a bipartisan resolution that effectively removes the president's authority to impose national security tariffs on Canada without explicit congressional authorization. This is the most significant constraint placed on presidential trade power in decades. For years, Trump has relied on Section 232 of trade law, the national security provision that allows the president to impose tariffs unilaterally. He has used it as a personal tool. He decides a country has displeased him, and he imposes economic punishment without consulting Congress, without seeking legislative approval, without any institutional check on his authority. He attempted to use this mechanism against Canada last week. He demanded immediate concessions on border policy, dairy access, and energy pricing. When Ottawa declined, he announced the tariffs, 25% on everything: oil, vehicles, steel, aluminum, lumber, agricultural products. The tariffs were scheduled to activate on Monday. Today, Congress removed that option. A veto-proof majority, Republicans and Democrats voting together, passed legislation that specifically shields Canada from unilateral executive tariff action. The margin was not narrow. It was overwhelming. 74 senators voted in favor, 26 opposed. Consider what that number represents. In the current political environment, achieving 74 votes on virtually any issue requires a fundamental break in partisan discipline. 25 Republican senators abandoned their president on a vote he had publicly demanded loyalty on. These were not the usual dissenters. These included senators from deeply conservative states, senators who depend on Trump's endorsement for their political survival, senators who have supported him on every previous confrontation. They looked at the economic data, they looked at the projections for their home states, and they concluded that the political cost of defying Trump was lower than the economic cost of supporting him. One Republican senator from a Midwestern state was overheard leaving the chamber saying he could not sell a recession to his constituents to prove a point. That statement captures the calculation that drove this vote. Fear. Not fear of the president. Fear of what the president's actions would do to the people who elected them. The intelligence behind this outcome did not originate in Washington. It originated in Ottawa. For the preceding 72 hours, Carney's team had been in direct communication with every significant governor, senator, and business leader in the states most vulnerable to a Canadian trade disruption. They did not issue threats. They did not make demands. They presented data. They showed precisely what would happen to the economy in Ohio if the border closed. What would happen to manufacturing in Michigan? What would happen to energy costs in Pennsylvania? They showed the math, and the math was devastating. American auto manufacturers sent a letter to Senate leadership signed by the executives of 3 major companies and 5 major energy corporations. The language was not diplomatic. It was explicit. They warned that if the tariffs activated on Monday, assembly lines in Michigan and Tennessee would cease operations within 48 hours. They warned that fuel prices in the Midwest would increase by 40 cents per gallon overnight. They stated in writing that this was not a negotiation tactic, but a supply chain collapse. Sources indicate that Carney's team helped provide the analytical foundation for that letter. They understood that the American business community had reached its breaking point. They understood that Trump's rhetoric functions effectively on television, but fails completely when tested against a spreadsheet. An image circulating from Ottawa shows Carney in a strategy session with his trade ministers. The table is covered not with maps of Canada, but with maps of American congressional districts. They had identified precisely which districts would absorb the most damage from a trade disruption, districts that Trump needs for upcoming elections. And they ensured that every representative in those districts understood exactly what was approaching. This was not conventional diplomacy. This was precision political engagement. Carney brought a surgical instrument to a confrontation where Trump was swinging wildly. When a reporter caught Carney leaving that meeting and asked whether he was concerned about the president's reaction, Carney did not break stride. He adjusted his glasses and said, "The math works for us. I hope the president checks his calculations." The fundamental question is how a president who rebuilt an entire political party around personal loyalty suddenly lost control of his own Senate. The answer lies in the mechanics of the trap he constructed for himself. Trump's negotiating approach has always depended on what strategists call the madman theory. Project enough volatility and unpredictability that the other party calculates surrender is cheaper than confrontation. This approach produced results against some opponents. It generated concessions from nations that calculated the cost of resistance exceeded the cost of compliance. But the approach depends on a critical assumption that the target has no viable alternative, that the pressure is so overwhelming and the options so limited that submission is the only rational choice. Carney eliminated that assumption systematically. When Trump threatened tariffs, Carney did not respond with counter-threats. He released a targeted list of American products that Canada would restrict in retaliation, and he ensured that list included specific products manufactured in the home states of the most politically influential Republican senators: bourbon from Kentucky, electronics from Texas, agricultural equipment from the Midwest. He made the political cost of supporting Trump's tariffs personal and specific for the senators, whose votes would determine whether the policy survived. Simultaneously, Carney was conducting outreach that bypassed the White House entirely. He communicated directly with state governors, with corporate executives, with labor union leadership. He presented a consistent message. The president is about to inflict damage on your economy. Here is the data that proves it. Here is what you can do to prevent it. And here is how Canada can help if you help us. It was a level of strategic sophistication that Washington was not prepared for. American institutions are accustomed to Canadian leaders who arrive in Washington seeking approval. Carney arrived with leverage, and he deployed it with the precision of someone who has spent decades understanding exactly how economic systems respond to pressure. The contrast between the two leaders explains the outcome. Trump operates on instinct and spectacle. He sees a problem and responds with maximum force, expecting the impact to produce compliance. Carney operates on systems analysis. He identifies pressure points. He calculates which actors have the ability to influence outcomes, and he applies exactly enough force to those specific points to produce the result he needs. Trump wanted to win a news cycle. Carney wanted to restructure a relationship. And today, the structural approach prevailed. The implications for ordinary people on both sides of the border are immediate and tangible. If those tariffs had activated on Monday, the cost of lumber for home construction would have increased by approximately 20%. Gasoline prices would have spiked. Grocery costs would have risen. Canada is the largest supplier of energy to the United States. Disrupting that supply produces consequences that arrive at the pump within days, not weeks. But beyond the immediate economic relief, this vote represents something larger. It signals a shift in how international relationships function when the traditional leader becomes the source of instability rather than the guarantee of order. For 70 years, the United States has occupied the central position in the global economic system. It set the rules. It established the norms. It provided the stability that allowed international commerce to function predictably. When the president of that system begins behaving erratically, when allies cannot predict whether agreements will be honored, when tariffs are imposed and withdrawn based on emotional reactions rather than strategic calculation, the system begins reorganizing around alternative centers of reliability. Canada just demonstrated that a middle power can successfully resist American economic coercion. That demonstration is being observed in every capital on Earth. European leaders are taking notes. Asian economies are evaluating implications. Every nation that has ever worried about being targeted by American trade pressure is processing the lesson that Carney just taught. Resistance is possible, and it can succeed. Trump intended to project overwhelming strength. Instead, he revealed that his power has limits. He revealed that when the economic consequences of his actions become severe enough, his own coalition will restrain him. And he revealed that a strategically sophisticated opponent can turn his own tactics against him. 3 trajectories are forming for the coming days. The first is administrative retaliation. Congress removed the tariff weapon, but the president retains other tools. He can order enhanced border inspections. He can slow commercial traffic through regulatory enforcement. He can create friction without technically violating the Senate resolution. Expect delays at border crossings beginning almost immediately. The second trajectory is legal confrontation. The president may challenge the congressional action through executive orders, claiming emergency authority that supersedes legislative restrictions. That fight would move to the courts. It would create months of uncertainty. Financial markets would react negatively to the ambiguity. The third trajectory is strategic retreat, disguised as victory. The president announces that productive discussions have occurred. He claims concessions that may not actually exist. Tariffs are abandoned. He declares triumph. This is the rational path, but it requires a capacity for tactical withdrawal that the president has rarely demonstrated. His current public communications suggest escalation rather than retreat. He is attacking the senators who voted against him, threatening political consequences, promising to support primary challengers. He is behaving as a wounded political figure who interprets institutional restraint as personal betrayal. Carney is watching this response carefully. The strategy sessions in Ottawa have not concluded. The analytical teams that mapped American congressional districts are still operational because Carney understands that the first confrontation may be resolved, but the underlying dynamic remains. A president who governs through intimidation will continue seeking targets, and preparation for the next round must begin before the current one fully concludes. The world shifted today. It shifted not through military action or dramatic confrontation, but through a vote. Through the mundane mechanics of legislative procedure, through 74 senators deciding that economic stability matters more than political loyalty to a single individual, Mark Carney proved something that will be studied in diplomatic and economic institutions for years. You do not need to be the largest power to prevail in a confrontation. You need to understand the systems that connect economies. You need to identify the pressure points that translate economic reality into political consequences. And you need the discipline to apply pressure precisely rather than broadly. Trump brought volume, Carney brought Arnie, mathematics. And today, mathematics won. The president is diminished but not defeated. The tools of executive power remain substantial even with tariff authority constrained. The coming weeks will test whether the institutional guardrails that activated today can sustain themselves against a leader who has consistently demonstrated willingness to challenge every boundary placed in his path. What happened in the Senate chamber this afternoon was not the end of this confrontation. It was the establishment of a new boundary, and the critical question going forward is whether that boundary holds. Whether the coalition that formed today maintains its cohesion under the pressure that will inevitably follow, and whether the demonstration that congressional authority can override presidential impulse on trade policy represents a permanent correction or a temporary pause before the next escalation. Carney is prepared for either outcome. His strategy does not depend on a single victory. It depends on structural repositioning that makes Canada progressively less vulnerable to American economic coercion, regardless of who occupies the White House. Every trade agreement signed with a non-American partner, every supply chain redirected toward alternative markets, every diplomatic relationship strengthened with European or Asian economies, each one reduces the leverage that any future American president can exert. That is the long game. And today, it advanced significantly, not because Canada is stronger than the United States, but because in this particular confrontation, Canada was smarter. And in a world where economic interdependence creates mutual vulnerability, being smarter matters more than being bigger. The gavel came down, the vote was recorded, and the relationship between these two nations entered a new phase. One defined not by the assumption of American dominance, but by the reality of mutual dependence. And mutual dependence requires something that has been conspicuously absent from Washington: respect. Carney did not demand respect through rhetoric. He earned it through results. And the 74 senators who voted today did so not because they suddenly developed affection for Canada. They voted because they understood that the alternative was economic damage to their own constituents that no amount of political loyalty could justify. That is what leverage looks like when it is deployed by someone who understands how the world actually works. And that is why tonight, the balance of power on this continent looks different than it did this